Hello, welcome back to Anime on the Sea to Sky. I understand. It's been a while. I've been going through a couple of mishaps, and especially whenever I've been going back into my previous ways as being a mountain hermit and thinking, okay, I'll bring up my laptop, I'll catch up on the shows that I need to for putting this episode out on time, and then I'm going to check, and then the update's going to fail, and then I'm going to forget my mic, and then I'm going to have to re-download and figure out a new drive because my laptop's Wi-Fi adapter is no longer working and it can't pick up any signal inside of the place that we're staying at, and it's kind of like, oh, well, alright, I'll get to finishing my required reading at some point and kind of see how the rest of that goes, so I definitely apologize for this one being late again. But I was glad I was finally able to get my rewatch out of the way, glad I was able to go through and finish off all the shows that I needed to, at least for the winter 2024 season, and see what's leading in the future, which, as I currently have looking at my schedule, I've got 14 shows that are coming out over the next 14 days. Okay. Well, I'm going to have a couple of things to catch up on back, but then if I completely forgot to say it again, hello, welcome back to Anime on the Sea to Sky. We are doing another retrospective, or at least look back 10 years into the past, which would have been a little more poignant if it was about a week or two earlier, because then we still would have been inside of the winter season, but in this case we're going to be doing it just on the cusp of the seasonal break and looking back on the winter 2014 anime season from a lens of a specific show that I want to talk about today. And I was trying to consider, it's like, well, I normally do news stuff, and going back through a lot of the major headlines that happened between January and March of 2014 is kind of not that pleasant. Between annexations, between large forever chemicals being spilt, large major conflicts happening on the world scale, and essentially all we get outside of that is that the winter 2014 Olympics ended up happening, which were also kind of being, not necessarily the best place, especially today, considering that in 2014 it was held in Russia. So that doesn't necessarily go with it, and it's kind of like, oh yeah, no, well, I mean, Boeing has been having some issues recently, and then specifically back in March of 2014, you had the Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 completely disappearing over the Gulf of Thailand, so I guess it's kind of topical. I don't know. I kind of just like to have a general idea about what is going on at those specific times in not necessarily recent history, but history nonetheless. So at the very least, it would be a little better to go back and kind of take a look at what the anime sphere was kind of looking at like around the beginnings of 2014, considering that we were still getting at that point a little bit more steady, at least on an influx of shows, OVAs, films, since we had 52 anime come out this one, including the leftovers that were like bleeding over from 2013. It was still kind of crazy, but I mean, there wasn't necessarily too much happening inside of, well, I mean, there were a handful of music videos. I mean, Comics Wave were still doing things like Crossroads. Little Busters had an OVA, Kyoken no Kanata, Noragami, Prisma Ilia. Like, all of these extras were like having a few in-between pieces that they could put out between seasons to at least keep their shows in the common thread of the audience. Tiger and Bunny had in terms of films, it's the same deal. Most of them were spin-offs in between. Tiger and Bunny got a film, Wake Up Girls, Idolmaster, Moritsu Pirates, Precure, so just a lot of these different idol and musical-centric pieces. But a couple of things that were bleeding over from 2013, we ended up having the second half of Samurai Flamenco, another season of Diamond No Ace, which is kind of one of those things where it's like, I know it's apparently a decent baseball show, but it's not necessarily anything too far out of the way, especially with, at that point in time, it had already gotten up to about 75 episodes, because there were still, like, decent long-running sports shows. I mean, heck, Hajime no Ippo Rising was coming out in this same season, as well as Yowamushi Pedal's second half. But it's definitely one of those ones where the only reason why I ended up getting 75 episodes in the first place was because, okay, it's baseball, we can definitely market this in Japan. Strike the Blood, Nagi no Asakara, or in this case, Lull of the Sea, Magi the Kingdom of Magic, Kuroko no Basket, Log Horizon, Golden Time, and also the specific topic that I had for the last episode, which was Kill la Kill. All of these were still having their second halves, so on top of everything else, there were just so many continuing series that were still making this a really decent start towards the rest of it, but on the ones that had the opportunity to at least get their premiere inside of 2014. Oh dear God, you had Pupa. I thought we were going to be going to get into the actual shows, but the shorts, Pupa was such a meme. It was this censored, ero-guro, incestuous, violent short series, I think about life and death cannibal siblings, and basically it just got on everybody's radar because of just how fucking ludicrous it was, especially for something that was just supposed to be a short. And Dean had been getting the short end of the stick. They had a bit of a rise for doing the Fate Stay Night adaptation back in 2007, and the Unlimited Blade Works film in 2008, but they had kind of just been falling off over the course of the early 2010s, and then this was kind of just, in most series, could have been a death row, could have just been the final straw that broke the camel's back, and it would have had given any opportunity to axe this studio, if not for the fact that 2 years later, they would have had the opportunity to do not only Rakugo Shinju, but then also the first season of Konosuba. But then, at the very least, a decent comedy sketch short that ended up happening, Tonari no Seki-kun. That was also a phenomenal one. It also has a really good AMV. I think it's Figaro no Seki-kun, where it's just all of these orchestras playing in the background of a dude that's essentially just making Rube Goldberg machines in the back of his class, where there's just one chick that always has to look at it. It's like, how can I do my schoolwork if I'm always getting distracted by all this shit that's literally happening 2 feet away from me? But honestly, that was a decent way to at least nullify whatever Pupa was sending out towards the rest of it. But then in terms of actual full-length television shows, I remember watching the first episode of Wizard Barristers, since there was a really decent cop chase scene that was going on where magic was being taken place in modern-day Tokyo, and episode 2 and episode 3 happened, and I remember that essentially falling off the face of the planet. Hosoki no Reikatsu, Welcome to Hell. I think it's more of a cult following. It's either that or something else, where it does have quite the unique style, especially taking a lot of inspiration from classic Japanese wall paintings and murals to have that opportunity to have their version of Japanese hellscape. But yeah, Supersonico, I'm trying to remember if Supersonico was a virtual idol first, or if she was a fan art generated mascot from something towards the rest of it. And then the only thing that I remember from the show is that when they had Podtaku, when they had like Holden Reviews, Distressed Jeans, Arcada, and Garnt, or the Anime Zone, Gigak, all on the first time they started a podcast, they talked about Supersonico episode 7, which was essentially just a really nice slice of life, go take a trip to the countryside episode that really ended up getting a few more eyes on it than usual, but then in reality it didn't really stand the test of time, and nobody has ever thought to look back on it since. So Sekai Seiku Zvezda plot was one where its name pops up time to time, where it's just a small organization trying to do world domineering pieces one step at a time, but it's not necessarily too much, but it's like, hey, stop smoking, hey, we're gonna change the Japanese economy, hey, so ones that were definitely shooting or hitting way above their belt, but it just didn't necessarily work out towards the rest of it. I only remember Hamatora because it had a really interesting OP, but that's about it. The second season of Seitoka Yakuindomo, which is just a high school sex comedy for the majority of the time, and then the other half of it is basically just height jokes because of one of the other members, so it's kind of like, not much you can do there. Oh, right, Sakura Trick, the lesbian physics-defying... Yeah, what is it? Lesbians Defy Physics, I think, is the only thing that I remember out of the show, because it's just a really ridiculous... Somebody's about to fall off of a banister off of their deck, and so somebody tries to throw themselves out to save somebody, and they just rotate in place, ignoring gravity. So I think the only thing I remember about that show, because not a lot happened outside of it, was just, oh, lesbians can defy gravity. It's like, it's an interesting little note to have. Witchcraft Works was a JC Staff show that had a really fun and dissonant tone of an ED, but then outside of that, there's not necessarily too much else that happened. Defrag was kind of in the same one. Engaged to the Unidentified, like, a lot of these had enough people watching them in the beginning, but the winter was definitely one of those seasons where a lot of these shows had found their niche audience, and then nobody has ever spoke about them ever again. The lesser known and less appreciated second season of Chunibyo which I think I dropped partway through. I remember enjoying the first season, considering it was done by Kyoto Animation, but then the introduction of the third girl didn't necessarily add too much towards the rest of it, and then the movie that came afterwards, Take On Me, ended up repairing a lot of the relationships that a lot of the fans had with the series. Probably not necessarily the biggest, the one that had there are two different shows that ended up having long-running fandoms, considering, well, one only got a sequel, and the other one got three seasons, but not enough to complete the manga that it was adapting, because even though the manga is now completed, they caught up way too quickly, and then they were kind of like, okay, well, now it's done, now we can go back to it. It's like, oh, nobody wants to watch this and nobody cares anymore. It's like, that's even worse, considering that you ended up getting three seasons or so out of it. Because Nisekoi was a Shaft harem rom-com show where the majority of it was just carried by the fact that it was a rom-com directed by Akiyuki Shimbo, considering he went from the Monogatari series over to this, and his quirks and eccentricities were the only reason that kind of made this show pop, because it's the same deal. It's like, hey, he has to marry this one Yakuza girl, I think, and then there's a childhood friend, and then there's a bodyguard of the Yakuza girl, and then there's the fourth party, I guess. It's just not something that... It was definitely one where it's like, oh yeah, the only reason this show got talked about as much as it did was because the discourse over the shipping wars kind of transcended any other conversation to be had. It's like, but is it good? And it's like, well, the romance isn't as fleshed out, the characters aren't as interesting, the animation makes it stand out considering all of the animation tricks that Shimbo is able to do because he's just that good of a director, but then nothing else really stood out about it. So as it faded into obscurity after its third season, everybody just completely forgot about it until the manga ended, and then people were able to talk about it again for a week, and then just nobody has been able to recommend it since, because it's just one of those rom-coms that had its time in the limelight, but then are you saying it's like, would you recommend that over literally X, Y, and Z, over all of these other phenomenal rom-coms? And it's kind of like, no, it's not even close. Although I do remember, considering that in the 2010s, there was a section where fan subbing had its rises and falls over the course of it, but there is one, God, I can't remember the name of the fan sub. Oh yeah, Kami subs. So they, of course you had standard stuff like Funimation and Crunchyroll that were still at the time doing the majority of these, but then there were still fan subbers before these major companies that came in for distribution. They would still add their own flourishes and editing techniques, and none were more prevalent than specifically in Nisekoi, especially with what they were able to accomplish. And they were just like animating over the shows themselves to give it even more a character than it already did. If anything that Nisekoi is going to be remembered for, it is going to be the Kami fan subs. And then this was the one other show that I was kind of thinking about doing this episode on, but over the course of this, it's only gotten a second season and has just completely fallen off the map and hasn't necessarily had as much of an impact as the other Bones show that we're going to be talking about. But this would have been Noragami. And so it had great fight animation for most of the time, with a decent cast and a lot of good characters to bounce off of each other. And it's kind of one of those where it's like, yeah, it's like it is the most bare bones 7 out of 10 action show where they are just above average to keep you invested. But as the show goes on, the cast outside of it doesn't necessarily get to pull their own weight until season 2. But then when you look back on it, it's like, okay, so it was good on the action, but kind of the same deal. Does it have enough to stand out towards the rest of the crowds? And I guess it didn't, considering that once it ended up getting its second season, and it had more than enough content to adapt for a third, it just fell off the face of the map. And I'm trying to remember if it was like 2016, 2017. No, even 2015. So it had those 2 years to go through and adapt those pieces, and then just nothing. Like, it's not of the same... What is it? I think No Game, No Life is the biggest season 2 where a lot of the memes coming out of the 2000s were mostly season 3 of a handful of these shows. And now we're leading into the 2020s, and the meme has gone down a step where it's kind of like, yo, season 2 for a lot of those pieces. But then, even then, I don't think there would be enough just notoriety, or just anything in general, to bring Noragami back, because I don't believe the story is concluded, but it still definitely doesn't have as much of a fan base as it did back in 2015, and unfortunately it definitely seems like one of those shows where, good as it was, it's not going to be able to stand the test of time, and it's not going to be remembered. Now, the other Bones show that kind of had a little more going on with it at the time, especially with the specific caveat that it was the first anime that was simuldubbed and aired in North America first, before it aired in Japan, considering that Adult Swim's Toonami block was still going on towards the rest of it inside of the middle of the 2010s, and they were able to collaborate with Tokyo MX, Funimation, Madman Entertainment, and have that opportunity where it's kind of like, okay, this is definitely something, because of the people involved in this project, there are going to be many more eyes than you would have expected by comparison to another, like any other anime that would have been coming out around the time, to say, hey, let's give this a little bit more of a flair. Let's at least, not necessarily break any boundaries, but at least, like, leave a stamp, like, make an impression on what at that time was which was at that time simuldubbing. And having the opportunity that within a week of the show coming out, you would have the opportunity to get any other language, which in this case, of course, is mostly English, but to have the opportunity to, within a week or two of the show coming out, having its English dub airing so soon after, was definitely not a endeavor that many of the distribution companies inside of the West had ever tried before. But because of the name, and because of the notoriety, and because of the people that were revolving around this, they were saying, hey, if there was any opportunity for us to have a almost universally talked about experience where you didn't necessarily have to wait to hear a show in multiple languages, let's try to give this a go. So this, of course, we're talking about Space Dandy, which was a series also animated by Bones, but specifically the series direction of this was done by Shinichiro Watanabe. And of course, this man has been a part of the anime industry since the mid-80s, because he's been like production assistants and episode direction on stuff like City Hunter, Dirty Pair, Capricorn, Macross Plus, The Vision of Escaflowne. Like, dude's definitely made his rounds. But then, of course, the ones that he is most well known for in the West is Samurai Champloo, and then, of course, Cowboy Bebop. And so kind of just to keep a running theme, because after he was able to series direct this, he was consistently doing a lot of other pieces towards the rest of it, since he had the opportunity to direct Terran Resonance, the Blackout OVAs done for Blade Runner 2022, Carol and Tuesday, and most recently, which is going to be, I believe, coming out this year, is going to be Lazarus. But at least in the West, probably one of the most well-known TV animation directors in the business, because of course you could talk about Miyazaki, but then most of that is just for film. And so because of his name and his influence, just so many opportunities, especially considering that this was almost like an open call for anybody to come and help him direct this series, which was going to be mostly musically centered around music from the early 80s and the 70s, about this, like, space dandy bastard who's, like, he is a womanizer, he is a loser, he is, at the very least, capable in some aspects, depending on the episode, depending on, like, what universe he's in. But it's definitely interesting to see how they were able to go through and use this as kind of like a catch-all to be like, look, you could literally do anything you want with almost any story, because Space Dandy was an original property. And by its nature, 90% of the episodes in this series are episodic, which, of course, not a lot of people are going to take. Not a lot of people like those episodic ones, because you definitely know that outside of like 3 to 4 episodes in the show, when you have an episodic series, it's really going to be hit and miss. And I do kind of feel that in the first half for sure, but then the second half has many more hits than it does misses by comparison, especially the last episode, which we'll get to. But in the beginning of the 2010s, there were a handful of companies that were able to coalesce and make something called the Animator Training Project, which then ended up being transformed into Anime Mirai, Anime Tamago, and then Anime Seed. And so this essentially was, I wouldn't be surprised if Bones and Watanabe wanted to like have their own part where it's kind of like, all right, here's the framework, You have this space surfing crew of a large cat alien, a vacuum cleaner robot, and then this space dandy who is a dandy guy in space, and just they're all going to be able to go off on their own separate adventures, and those adventures to any planet, to any universe, with any job, with any mission, all of you can just basically have free reign. And give animators that kind of freedom was definitely transformative in a lot of what they were able to accomplish later on in their careers, especially with the influence of Watanabe and the impact that the show was able to have, and give these other animators and directors and storyboarders, all of these people who had a lot of experience inside of the industry, to go and direct their own episodes and kind of see where they would be able to take it and see if they would be able to move that forward. As much as I would like to start off strong with Shingo Natsume, I'll definitely get to him. But at the very least, one of the ones that I would like, but at the very least, a really strong start for this series would have been Sayo Yamamoto, where she mostly took around storyboarding and production managing in the early 2000s, where she was able to at least give a bit of her talents on stuff like Technolize, Samurai Champloo, Gunslinger Girl, Ergo Proxy, Kemonozume, where she was at least able to meet Young Choi and Masaki Yuasa for the first time. That must have been a phenomenal experience, leading to work with Akiyuki Shimbo and Arakawa Under the Bridge, before having her first main series direction credit as Lupin III, The Woman Named Fujiko Mine, which is this very overt, sensual, unique backstory on Fujiko Mine from the Lupin III franchise, and seeing what she was able to accomplish there, leading into a handful of other OVAs that she would do for the series later on, gave her more than enough of an opportunity to kind of just not necessarily bring a bit more maturity into the anime sphere, but definitely with the style that she was able to do with TMS and the Lupin characters. It's honestly one of the more unique styles that I've seen inside of a show. And considering that she was able to go through and take those into the Space Ramen episode, as well as, I could totally see her doing that, where instead of accentuating the female body as she does for the majority of her ones, they ended up doing a rock and roll mockumentary style episode where she is just really bringing Dandy and Johnny fully up front and using their eroticism as one of the main draws for their musical act, especially with the climax that happens at the end of the episode. Just everything going up in a literal ball of flames was honestly one of my favorites of the entire show. Considering that after she was able to do Space Dandy, she had an opportunity for a film for Toru's Adventure, doing a handful of episode direction for Shingeki no Bahamut Genesis, but then having her original direction credit to go to Yuri on Ice. Honestly, one of the biggest shows to come out in 2016. The only negative thing is that that's the last major series or film that she's directed, because currently we are just permanently on indefinite hiatus for the Yuri on Ice film, Ice Adolescence, which I really hope she has the opportunity to finish, because if we have any opportunity to go back into the world of Yuri on Ice, I would take any opportunity to do so. Leading into Hiroshi Shimizu, who, to be fair, it's not necessarily as much. He did the Gallant Gentleman, he did the Dog episode, he did do the Deception episode as well, and there wasn't necessarily as much for me to go back on to kind of see where they'd been. But looking back on what they were able to, before, they're just a titan of the industry. Hiroshi has essentially been around since the mid-80s, working on, the Doraemon films, but then ended up doing a lot of key animation at Studio Ghibli for both Porco Rosso, for Only Yesterday, for Ocean Blue, Princess Mononoke. This dude was able to do so much, and then moving on to fucking Gainax, who did a handful of key animation pieces for Fooly Cooly and Jinro and Technolize, and looking through this dude's resume is just absolutely insane. Millennium Actress, working with Satoshi Kon, this man is absolutely insane. Paranoia Agent, Monster, same deal with key animation for Samurai Champloo, Beck, Fullmetal Alchemist, The Girl Who Looked Through Time. He was able to go through and do script writing and episode direction and meet Masaki Yuasa whenever doing the production for Kemonozume, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, more pieces with Lupin III, and then finally having the opportunity to go through and have a few pieces of episode direction for Space Dandy, where afterwards he never really came back into the episode direction. He's mostly only done anime direction and key animation ever since Space Dandy ended, but then same deal, continued to work with Shinichiro Watanabe on Terran Resonance. He was the chief animation director for Rolling Girls, which was also a phenomenal original series. He ended up going back and working with Shingo Natsume for One Punch Man. Totally, once you see the roll call for One Punch Man Season 1, I could totally agree that the majority of the reason why One Punch Man looked so good was because Shingo Natsume had the opportunity to not only build up his resume and his connections before Space Dandy, but then meet all of these people inside of this production and then turn the first season of One Punch Man into one of the greatest seasons of animated television, period. Of course, he ended up going over with Sei Yamamoto and doing key animation for Yuri on Ice, was an animation director for Megalobox, did Fully Coolly Progressive, we don't want to talk about that. And then more recently, he was an animation director for the final episode of Pluto. This man is a literal monster. His CV, you could just hand to anybody, and it's like, man, we want you on your project. So the fact that he was able to go through and still scratch that itch and have the opportunity to do episode direction on a handful of those pieces inside of Space Dandy was just a phenomenal opportunity to at least show that he has the potential, but knowing where his strengths lie, he's still going to probably continue to just do animation direction, character design, and key animation, leading into the rest of his career. Now, it was tough to kind of go through and find Michio Mahara, considering that they mostly had the opportunity to do one of the most polarizing episodes, The War of the Undies and the Vests. Literally the first 20 minutes of that episode is complete garbage, but then when you have the opportunity to go, at the very least you can watch the clip on YouTube, where essentially Space Dandy is able to go through and surf through the stars to a phenomenal backing track. That's the only thing that you need to take out of this episode. And then kind of seeing where bottle episodes are definitely more their style, considering that they did, at least the bottle broke inside of episode 5. They ended up doing the day in court as well, which kind of not really much you could do there. But they kind of have the same sort of story as Hiroshi Shimizu, considering that not necessarily too much for episode direction, but they've still been around since the 80s. I mean, they worked on Midnight Eye, they worked on Record of Lodoss War, Rojin Z, the 6 Urusei Yatsura films, Saturn City of Wado, Ninja Scroll, same deal. The fact that they had already been in this industry for about 25 years before the show came around, and just seeing what they'd able to go and work on before going through and working with Natsume and Watanabe for the first time, it's like, dude, the Memoir, Memories, Satoshi Kon OVAs, Princess Mononoke, Spriggan, same deal with Paranoia Agent for episode direction, Paprika, Kaiba, Batman Gotham Knight. It's absolutely ridiculous to see, the bodies of work that these people have worked on. Punchline, I was about to say, well, before Space Dandy, they still had the opportunity to do episode direction for the Tatami Galaxy and Kickheart, and then ever since then, they haven't necessarily tried their hand at direction. Since then, they've still just stuck with Crayon Shinchan and Doraemon, so more kid-oriented TV shows. But still, just taking a look at these resumes, damn, they have really been able to put themselves out there. Now, I guess the easiest way to talk about these two would definitely be in tandem, considering that you have Eun-Young Choi and Masaki Uwasa, considering that they're the two major minds behind Science Saru. They mostly worked with Tatsunoko and Madhouse beforehand, before making their own studio, but just kind of seeing what they were able to do. We'll start with Eun-Young first, considering that she had also been a key animator since the mid-2000s, before meeting Uwasa. And she had the opportunity to go through and direct the Plant episode, which was definitely I could definitely see Science Saru, or at least the inspiration behind that kind of style, be very much up her alley. But before all of that, she ended up doing key animation for stuff like Black Cat, for Black Lagoon, doing works in tandem with Madhouse, with Masaki Uwasa for Kemonozume, for Kaiba, for Kashirin Sins, for Tatami Galaxy, doing their own startup for Kickheart, and then finally having the opportunity to do, episode direction, script writing, key animation, character design, basically all those pieces for that episode on the rest of it, before going with Yuasa and then working on stuff like Ping Pong the Animation, Garo, The Night is Short Walk On Girl, But at that point, she had definitely reached her... Like, she's honestly been a phenomenal animator for all the pieces that she's worked on, but especially after creating Science Star with Yuasa, she definitely took over the majority of the roles of production, producing, since she had the knowledge, and being in the shoes of a lot of these animators that came before, you definitely needed somebody to be a producer, to have the opportunity to go around and find those connections, especially with what she was able to learn from Shinichiro Watanabe and the crews behind over at Bones. It was great to see what she was able to do with Yuasa after everything, because she's essentially produced every other work that he has done outside of that. However, she did have the opportunity to direct her own short episode inside of the Star Wars Visions, so that was a good opportunity for her to kind of just go back and flex her animation muscles just to kind of see what she would be able to create. But then in terms of Yuasa's definitely is the name that is more well-known inside of the industry, because it's kind of the same deal. He had been around much longer, like way longer, like back, he was animating Doraemon back in 79, but Yuasa had still been around for decades before he was able to meet Young Choi at this point, like working on stuff like Doraemon, Crayon Shinchan, Aika, Samurai Champloo, doing a lot of key animation stuff, and then just completely flipping the script and saying, okay, well, we want you to direct a original film for us. What do you got for us? I'm going to give you Mind Game. And it's like, what the fuck did you just give us? Mind Game is such a ridiculous expression of animation, and one of those where it's like, dude, I have no fucking idea what's going on. It's definitely one where a lot of people would just recommend to be like, you just can't watch this movie sober. Like, take whatever you want, but then expect to have a trip towards the rest of it. Because essentially it's like, dude's trying to protect a woman, Yakuza guy comes in, threatens girl, guy stands up for girl, guy gets shot through his ass, and meets God, and gets thrown back in time to see what he would be able to do differently. It's like, what the fuck is going on? But then after all those other pieces, directing Kemonozume, directing a part of a Genius Party, directing Kaiba, he definitely had the largest repertoire out of the majority of the people that came inside of this cast before directing an episode inside of Space Dandy. Like, I mean, dude, Welcome to the Space Show, Tatami Galaxy, Photokano, actually no, Photokano he mostly just did storyboards, but like his resume speaks for himself. Oh yeah, but then of course doing his own crowdfunded Kickheart OVA, which was honestly phenomenal. And maybe we'll do Ping Pong the next episode. Oh, I really need to rewatch Ping Pong. God, it is so good. It's still, Ping Pong to me is probably the best show, like the best TV anime I've seen that I can recall, because of course I have Legends of Galactic Heroes as the best OVA series, Your Name is my favorite film, Ping Pong the animation is probably my best series by far, even though, God, it is coming up. It is probably at least 6 years since I've rewatched it, so that should really give me a good opportunity for the next episode. But I'm definitely getting my head in myself, especially with how I've been delaying this one specifically, but only time will tell. So he's able to go through, bring his experience towards the production inside of Space Dandy, and then just continue on creating stuff after this ended up going through, making a handful of connections, but then directing the Night is Short Walk On Girl film, taking a lot of these pieces that he was able to go through with Science Saru, that he was able to help create. He ended up doing another film called Lure Over the Wall. He made the viral sensation Devilman Crybaby for modern audiences. Eizouken is also probably my favorite show of 2020, but Japan Sinks 2020 kind of just on a little bit of a, it's been, yeah, I don't know. He was the original creator for Yurei Deco. I'm kind of glad that he wasn't, because that was the most recent thing he did before going on a hiatus, because it's like, dude deserves his rest. Like, holy shit, he's 59. Judging by all the photos that I'd seen, I would have expected he would have been in his late 40s, but like, fuck, dude's 59. Dude needs a break if he wants to, like, make anything in the future. But, I mean, he was the director of Inuo, which is one of my most recent favorite films, period. It was like, Japan Sinks walked so Inuo could run, since he was able to have that a little bit of a dip there, but then still have the opportunity to bounce back and make that rock anthem of a film honestly phenomenal. Everything... Oh, and Ride Your Wave, too. Ride Your Wave is a nice romance. anything that Science Saru has made over these past, 10 years, honestly, I would go give a recommend to it, because Yuasa is easily one of my favorite directors of the modern era. Kiyotaka Oshiyama, kind of in the same boat. This entire series in general, it's tough to even talk about what happens, because yes, you have a space crew of 3, and they go to a restaurant called Boobies, and they're being chased by the Empire, and mishaps just happen all around them. That's all you need to do. It's there is a mishap and an event that happens, but where they took those was all in the hands of the animators and the directors inside of that time, which was honestly a phenomenal choice. But Kurotaka, he definitely, one of the same deal, had been around the industry since the mid-2000s, very much like An Young-choi, did key animation for Shuffle, for Gurren Lagann, for Bokurano, and then had his first animation directing credit for Denocoil, which was honestly one of my favorite shows to come out of the 2000s, which I only watched about a handful of years ago, because their idea of augmented reality connected to the internet, even though this was back in the mid-2000s, was definitely way ahead of its time, and something that I kind of hope AR focuses more on, leading the themes of that series, but that's beside the point. Moving on to what they were able to do afterwards, same deal. Did key animation for Momo, did animation for The Wind Rises. Everybody wanted to be a part of that film, considering that it might have been Miyazaki's last, but then, of course, that was 11 years ago. Miyazaki still sounds like he's got one in the tank. But yes, he did have the opportunity to, solo everything with The Big Fish, because that's all this episode was. It was just about a big fish, the Munagi. But it was interesting, because the style definitely reminded me more of something out of Science Saru, but the unique animation that they were able to accomplish, especially with the muddy fisherman's planet that this takes place on, was just a phenomenal setup for such a simple premise. I'm definitely glad that he was able to have the opportunity to stretch his wings on this one. Because after that, he ended up doing Flip Flappers, as he was the director and the scriptwriter for that original series, which was the same deal. 2016 really did have a lot of unique originals that ended up coming out, and a lot of those people were able to springboard from the connections that they had made in Space Dandy to make all of these other original productions in the years leading off afterwards. But ever since then, that was just the last thing that he directed. He definitely went back to doing episode direction and storyboarding for Devilman Crybaby, but then the majority of stuff would either be character design, mechanical design, and key animation for stuff like, Decadence, Princess Principal, Sona Bisdol, the first Slam Dunk, and then same deal, he ended up coming back for key animation on The Boy and the Heron or How Do You Live? However, I am curious to see what he's going to be able to accomplish here, because he has been named the director of Look Back, which is going to be a film adaptation of Tatsuki Fujimoto's one-shot. So, to be fair, with everything this man has under his belt, and the proven deal for direction and management and storyboarding and just everything that he was able to accrue over his experiences inside of this industry, I completely trust him with this adaptation. So nearing the end here, we have Satoshi Saga, who is definitely more in the same vein as Masaki Yuasa. Dude's been around since the 80s, worked on key animation for stuff like iCity, Outlanders, Legend of the Galactic Heroes, City Hunter, Rojin Z. It's hey, Hunter x Hunter, you're hearing a lot of familiarities with a handful of people. It's definitely nice to see some overlap, especially with that kind of place. Oh, Hitman Reborn. Sorry, Jacob, I really do need to catch up on that at some point. But he was able to have his first directing credit back for an OVA about the original Hunter x Hunter, and Hungry Heart, so not too bad, in the early 2000s. And then a handful of storyboards, handful of directing credits throughout the majority of the mid to late 2000s, episode director on Shiki, episode director for Hidan no Aria, Aria the Scarlet Ammo. Wow, that was one of the first shows I ever watched back in 2011. Jesus. Zero no Tsukaima. Man, this man was really... He was directing a lot of episodes inside of so many of the shows that I was watching getting into this industry. This is crazy. Outbreak Company as well. Jesus, the episode that he directed inside of Space Dandy was one of 6 episodes that he ended up directing over the course of, Space Dandy's second season. So 5 shows, 6 episodes all within the span of a year. And also ended up doing episode direction for Origairu. So, yeah, not so bad. He was definitely someone where a lot of the people that I've talked about in this episode, where they were able to springboard and like take their ideas and their connections that they had from the show to bring it out and make new projects towards the rest of that. This is definitely not one that they brought on Satoshi for, considering that most of him is just like contracting and outsourcing himself for specific episode direction on like any other series that you could think of. It's like, dude just covers so many other pieces. I mean, he did episodes for Working, for Dagashi Kashi, for Tsukika Kirei, for fucking Arrow Manga Sensei. Oh, dear God. Handful of things for Fate Apocrypha, Wodokoi, Grand Crest Senki, SAO, Alicization. Must have had a blast when he was going through Ishizoku reviewers, Jesus Christ. And unfortunately, he ended up finishing the rest of this with Higurashi Sotsu. Damn, man, after all the things that you've done, the fact that that was one of the more recent things that you ended up directing for an episode, God, I'm really sorry to hear that. Leading on to Masahiro Mukai, another middle of the 2000s graduate, where they ended up doing Star Frogs, Arakawa, had episode direction, which, like, damn, they were mostly doing stuff for Star Frogs, and then within 7 years had the opportunity to be an episode director for Madoka Magica. That's insane. So working on a handful of pieces throughout Denpa Onna, Bento, Itoboku SS, episode director for Kurikono Basket, Welcome to Hell, and kind of a lot of those same deals. He did have the opportunity beforehand to do this to direct the small OVA, but not really much that you can do there. Kind of went on a similar track record to Satoshi, only recently after he did, because he was going through and doing episode direction for pieces of the second half of Space Dandy, but then he would stick around with Bones for a bit, and then helping Shinichiro Watanabe with Sankyo no Terror, going with Bones for Kekkai Sensen or Blood Blockade Battlefront, did stuff with Snow White and the Red Hair. Trickster, I can't remember if it was an original thing. He tried to do an original thing in 2016 back, God, like, how do you even say this title? Trickster Edogawa Rampo. I mean, sure, but afterwards, at the very least, he was able to use those opportunities and those pieces to bring on his direction, because afterwards, he kind of got loaded in, as he would be now known today as the director for My Hero Academia. He didn't have the opportunity to direct the first season, the second season. He only did episode direction for the third season of My Hero, but considering all of the production woes that Bones was now going through with trying to squeeze in a movie between every other season of the show, they needed somebody else, they needed somebody experienced to go through and man the ship towards the rest of the series, which a lot of people say the series hasn't lived up to anything that it's done since season 2 or 3. Each season has its highs and lows, but I will admit that the original 2 and 3 were more consistent. But now, Masahiro Mukai has just been known as the general director for everything past season 4, since he did do storyboarding for Mob Psycho season 2 and episode direction for Lupin the Third, but afterwards it's like, no, he has been the de facto director for My Hero Academia for the 4th, 5th, 6th, and odds are the 7th season as well. Yeah, never mind. And then he ended up getting taken off for the 6th season, or after the 6th season. Well, what can you do? 3.5 seasons is decent enough. Now, the last director I do want to talk about, considering that I would say the director who has been able to do not the most since Space Dandy, but he is definitely one of the most notable episode directors, because he was named the director for, like, I would say secondary director. Like, he was the secondary main director of this series under Shingo Natsume. And even though Watanabe was the chief director, Watanabe was the one that was able to direct the first episode, the 13th episode, and the final episode, which all 3 of them are greats. With 3 different stories and 3 different themes and 3 different just sets that he was able to go and mold to his heart's content. But he is definitely like one of the biggest names attached to this production, considering that he's still not as long, same deal, got into animation in the early 2000s, was doing a lot of key animation stuff. He was doing Shakugan no Shana, Zero no Tsukaima, Welcome to the NHK, handful of episodes of Naruto Shippuden, pieces of Nodame Cantabile, second key and key animation for Gurren Lagann, Bokurano, Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, Welcome to the Space Show, Panty and Stocking. Like, this dude was definitely building up his resume to go through and have the opportunity to shadow one of the best directors inside of the industry. Because if there was ever any episodes that I would have liked to talk about Space Dandy, is that Space Dandy has a great pilot and a great finale. It definitely gets you into the mood. You know exactly what these characters are about. You know, essentially, like, they're not necessarily deep, but you know where the majority of the show's episodes are going to go, and it's a great baseline to be set. The kaiju fight that you end up getting inside of episode 13 is honestly one of the best spectacles that the show has to offer, only second to the final episode. Because if you are a Shingo Natsume fan who's looking for any other piece of content that he has to offer, like, basically these 3 episodes on their own are not necessarily a complete story. It's not something like Cowboy Bebop where technically you could watch those 5 episodes that would go around all of Spike's backstory, get the whole story, and then the story's over. But it's all of those episodic pieces in the middle that really flesh them out and really give them a lot more depth than you would have had the opportunity to expect. The same deal goes with the entirety of Space Dandy. So it is tough. I don't think Space Dandy is as good as Bebop, but then not many things are. So having the opportunity to go back and actually see the sheer scale of what this episode was able to accomplish was just honestly bringing me up to, like, labeling it as one of my favorite episodes in anime, period. Because I am very much a ensemble cast guy, and whenever any show has the opportunity to do like an Avengers Endgame moment where we are going to bring every other character that has been a part of this series, which already makes it weird enough because it is episodic. Most of these are in different planes of existence, different universes, different times. But the fact that across time and space, the show can still take every major character that this show has been building up in a lot of these other episodes and still have the opportunity to bring them back and coalesce into this one phenomenal showcase of animation and spectacle easily makes this one of my favorites. The Yutaka Nakamura cuts are just being thrown out on full display here. You honestly keep trying to think if this episode can go even higher. Can it break the shackles and go beyond the cut that, like, the animation cut that happened before is going to get overthrown. And then it's like, oh, it's the coolest thing I've ever seen. And then the next cut happens, and it's like, holy shit, that was the coolest battle I've ever seen. And then the next cut happens, and it's like, oh my god, that scale is larger than anything else that we'd ever seen in the series. And then it just keeps going. And then it keeps one-upping itself, all within the span of like a really nice 24-minute package. And it just phenomenally encapsulates, with a very natural ending, how all of this series was going to end, and then if it has the opportunity to do anything else in the future, which definitely doesn't necessarily lead too well because it's been 10 years and not necessarily a lot has happened, but it was amazing to see what Natsume was able to do with just the handful of episodes that he was able to go through and create on his own, and then have the opportunity to oversee and make connections. And, like, seriously, when I said before that I don't think One Punch Man's first season would be as good as it was if not for the fact that Natsume was able to go and be taken under Watanabe's wing, be the co-director, have the opportunity to meet all of these wonderful people, make these connections, see where their strengths lied, and had the opportunity to place them and use their talents to the best of their abilities, because that's the biggest thing. That was one of the biggest misconceptions about One Punch Man's first season. Even though it looked so much better than everything else that had came out around it, it's still the same budget. It's still the same time. It still was within the realm of every other group that every other anime was making inside of that season, inside of that time frame. But Natsume was able to accrue all of these people into one universal vision and to essentially make... He took the animated sequences and the sheer scale and polish that he had made inside of Space Dandy, and then took it to another level with all of these other works inside of an adaptation in One Punch Man, and still to this day has created one of the best looking, best managed, and best showcases of animation inside of the industry, period. Because sure, this was done by Madhouse, sure, this was done by another group in the second and third seasons. Natsume wouldn't have the opportunity to go back and make something as spectacular as that, even though he's still been moving forward and working inside the industry. He still did key animation for Mob Psycho. He ended up becoming the director 2 years after One Punch Man, leading into Akka 13, which I honestly thought was just a great snapshot at a fictional country and culture and history as they were able to go through. He worked with Masaki Iwasa, storyboarding for Night is Short, Work on Girl, one of my favorite films of all time, and then bringing back a 2000s classic in Boogie Pop Phantom and being the director for that series, leading into create another original work of his back in 2021 called Sunny Boy, which was arguably one of the best originals to had come out in the previous couple of years. And if there was anybody that I would have thought to have the opportunity to do a sequel to the Tatami Galaxy and be the one to have Masaki Yuasa trust him with his vision and his way of his interpretation of the characters, the fact that he was also able to recently do the adaptation of Tatami Time Machine Blues. Like, Natsume can't miss. It's having the opportunities, especially inside of this industry, to create something of this magnitude. And even though it's incredibly difficult and crunching, and just Natsume is one of those directors that I appreciate exists in this space because he's been through the doldrums, he's been through the trenches, he knows how fucking hard it is. But then with that production knowledge, he is able to optimize and use everybody's time correctly and assort their talents and their specialties and their priorities to a manner that doesn't strain or burn out the people underneath his wing. And for somebody to at least take all of that and use that knowledge and take the pieces that he was given inside of Space Dandy and to then mold that into some of the best productions that we have seen in the modern day, then regardless of the episodic nature of Dandy and wherever his adventures may take him, I'm definitely glad to have that opportunity to see that the adventures that he left behind were be able to taken up by others to change the lives of the people that he had met in his adventures and along the way, and to see how they would be able to change their universes in turn for the better. So I'm definitely glad I had the opportunity to go through. It's been a while. I definitely apologize. I'm going to get right back on it and see where these next couple of episodes take me. Hopefully I'll be able to get another one out over the next coming weeks, and we're just going to have to see where that goes and catch myself up, at least at some point in the future. Who knows? Cheers, have a good one. Stay dandy.